Okay. Hello to those of you who've made it in today. I'm not quite sure where everyone else is. They can all blame it on the weather or something. I wanted to pick up a tiny bit from what we watched about the Congo last time, and just offer one other thought, which I think is oftentimes when people treat the end of empires. We're going to talk today about how empires start. The other thing is because of something that's going on, we're going to finish at just before 10:30 today. And so hopefully I will not have to squeeze everything in and talk like the guy in the old FedEx commercial. That's how old I am. I remember that commercial. But when people talk about the end of empires, one of the things that this BBC documentary I think falls into is that if you looked at the amount of time in that documentary spent discussing the colonial period and then the post-colonial period, an enormous percentage, comparatively, was spent on especially the post-independence period and the period in which Mobutu Sese Seko, Joseph Mobutu, was the president of what was called Zaire for a while. And it seems to me that there was a sort of a discrepancy in that you had close to 100 years of colonization, whether by the King of Belgium or by the Belgian government. But that was sort of telescoped, and then you spent an enormous amount of time walking around Mobutu's mansion. And I wondered, did that strike anyone? That it seemed that there was this sort of saying, well, here's all this colonial stuff, and it happened, but let's now focus especially on the excesses of Mobutu. That it struck me as a little bit imbalanced. And that oftentimes, when people look at recent history, they tend to blow up what has happened more recently and view it perhaps out of proportion to what had gone before. That is, to think about, this is the most recent thing, this is a thing perhaps we've got the best footage of, we can go walk around this palace. Let's emphasize this for the entire second half of the program. And for the first half, we'll talk about the time in which, the Belgians managed to kill millions of people. So that, and sort of to say that and to sort of disconnect them in some ways. By spending so much time in Mobutu, you wound up with, in some ways, not negating, but reducing the amount of influence, you might say, that the colonial period had on the development of the Congo. So that's one other thing I was thinking as I watched this before, was just that this is not there's not a proportionate sense here of what went on before colonialism and what went on after colonialism, but rather a much greater sort of emphasis on a very particular incident after, a very particular couple of decades after colonialism, but not, you might say, sort of the majority of the modern history of the Congo. All right, that out of the way, I want to talk a bit about European imperialism. We're going to be talking on Wednesday specifically about Gandhi's reaction to imperialism. And so what I want to talk about today is why you get, in the late 19th century, this enormous scramble to take territory outside of Europe. We've already talked about the fact that the United States and the Japanese are both involved in colonial ventures themselves, that they both see colonization as a way of enhancing their great power status. They're not alone in this. This is the trend in the late 19th century for the major industrialized powers of the world, in Western Europe, in Asia, and in North America. That colonization is seen as the answer. What we have to look at is sort of what is the question, or what are the questions, and just how well does colonization answer those questions. And we're not only going to talk about sort of why you get this massive expansion of colonial rule, but also how. It's one thing to have the motivation, you might say, to go and conquer other lands, but you also have to have the means. And in the late 19th century, you have coming together both a significant motivation to colonize and the invention of or perfection of various sorts of means, whether in transport or in medicine in particular, that will allow colonization to move forward. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about, you might say, sort of the motivation and then the means. And we'll look at a couple of specific examples as we go. If we have to, we'll talk a little bit on Wednesday before we discuss Gandhi's reaction to colonialism. This is a map of the British Empire at the turn of the 20th century. School children and others were taught that the map of the world was colored red or colored pink that is, depending on whose map you use, that's the colors they were used to depict the British Empire. The favorite saying of many was that the sun never set on the British Empire, to which people in Ireland replied, that's because God doesn't trust them in the dark. But that's a different story for you have to take the Irish history class. You have, in particular, in sub-Saharan Africa, in the late 19th century, this enormous attempt by European powers to carve up territory. And we haven't even talked, but there's also in Southeast Asia a similar sort of intensification of empire. But nowhere is it more sort of profound, and nowhere is it sort of carried out more publicly than in the case of sub-Saharan Africa. And now what I'd like to point to is a couple of things that are driving this in the late 19th century. There are two rationales offered for colonial rule. And we've talked about them in some senses. When we talked about the American expansion of the 1890s and early 1900s into places like the Philippines, I mentioned that there were people who championed empire as the solution to, or the way in which the United States could achieve great power status. What were the, I'm looking for some volunteers here, what were the motivations? Think about the people who championed empire. What were the motivations that they had? Power, okay, but how are we going to, in what ways power? We're on the right track. Power, making the United States a quote-unquote great power. Getting land, for what purposes?
Legitimacy.
Navy.
Legitimacy, hold on, who said Navy? Somebody said Navy. Okay, so we've got Navy. What do you, how, think about that in a little broader sense. Why would you want, what is one of the reasons why the United States was quite happy to take control of the Philippines?
Because I do something like a dock.
Yeah. A dock, a base. One of the rationales for colonialism that is offered in the late 19th century, that's very popular, is that colonialism is going to be strategic. In the late 19th century, you have the emergence of powers like Japan and the United States, and you also have a couple of other things. If you got your phones up, please put them away. You have, in the 1870s, the emergence of a unified German state. You can't overestimate how important this is for the rest of Europe. What had been a collection of German-speaking states becomes united under the leadership of the largest of them, called Prussia, in 1871. There's now a German empire at the heart of Europe. A massive military, it has a massive military capability, especially in army. And so you have, in Europe, great concern about the balances of power, about the ways in which geopolitical rivalries are going to play out. You have European states looking to shore up their positions, in some sense, strategically. Just as the United States, just as Japan in some ways, are looking to colonize for strategic purposes. Think of the United States taking over and running the Panama Canal Zone. Again, giving them control over this vital strategic point in the global economy. Giving them control over this vital element in global shipping. So strategic colonialism is one of the things. We talked about that admiral. Actually, not the admiral, but the naval officer. We talked about Alfred Thayer Mahan. We talked about the importance of sea power in history, that book that he wrote. So there's strategic colonialism. What's the other reason for colonialism that we talked about informing this American drive to take territories? If there's strategic colonialism, how might you classify the other? Think about those guys in Hawaii, the sugar planters in Hawaii.
To avoid paying, saving money.
To avoid paying money, let's think about it in a little bit larger, more thematic way. John?
Economic?
Yeah,
Colonialism.
exactly. Economic colonialism. This is the other thing. In the late 19th century, we talked about power. There are specific concerns about strategic power. How do you keep your state powerful in a world where you're seeing an emerging United States and Japan, a very powerful Germany, a Britain which has the navy that literally controls the seas? How do you maintain your strategic power? How also do you maintain your economic power? In the late 19th century, there is, as I mentioned before, when we talked about the American experience in Hawaii, there is a crash in the global primary products market. Food prices, price of grain, of dairy products, of beef, they all plunge because of massive overproduction. When these primary producing countries, or places that depend on the export of primary goods, a place like, say, again, Argentina, to some extent a place like Canada and Australia, when these places suffer economically, they don't buy manufactured goods from the big industrial states. And so the big industrial states start to falter as well. So in the late 19th century, you have a situation where the global economy is cooling down after the period of the first industrial revolution, and where nation states are beginning to realize they're going to have to compete economically, and they're going to have to compete economically in a much tighter economy. That's when you start to see things like tariffs that we talked about in the United States. It's where people start to argue that colonialism not only will help you strategically, but will aid you economically. That colonialism will give you control of resources. Valuable resources in the late 19th century. What did King Leopold? Rubber in the Congo. Did anyone know what was before rubber? The big thing in the Congo? Rubber's around sort of the early 1890s. What's called the Congo Free State shifts from harvesting, you might say, one sort of resource to harvesting rubber. Ivory, exactly. Because they've run out of pachyderms. This is the part that gets my children especially. The hippos and the elephants disappear from Central Africa by the thousands in the 1880s. Because the Belgians put in place the same system they'll use for rubber. They force people to go out and slaughter animals for ivory. Ivory which will be used in decorations, ivory which will be used to make jewelry, ivory which will be used to make pianos. All these sort of trappings of middle-class European life require ivory. And so there's a huge market for it. And you have the mass slaughter of both people and animals, because if the people do not produce enough ivory in a village, the Belgians will kill them, will collectively punish them. So it's rubber. These things at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, you have these commodities that are enormously valuable. And the idea that some people have is that if you can control access to these commodities, so you can get them cheaply, but other people can't get access to them as cheaply, that will aid your own industrial economy. There are other people, there's another side of this economic argument. There's some people who say, colonize to get control of natural resources. There are other people who say, colonize because that will give you captive markets. Captive places where you can sell your goods and no one else can. Now here's one thing that we ought to think about. Can you have a place that will produce for you cheap natural resources and a place that will also serve as a captive market for your goods? Can those two exist simultaneously? Yes? How so?
Well, what about the U.S. Colonies? I mean, the raw materials came that had to go and be manufactured in Great Britain and then sold back to the colonies. Wouldn't that be your captive market?
Well, who's going to buy them in these colonies?
The people.
Okay. How are you going to price those goods?
Well, if you got something like cotton, so the cotton came from the colonies, and now you're buying clothes, I don't know, price it based on...
Okay. Well, here's the question. How do you ensure that you get really cheap raw materials?
Slavery.
Not slavery, but perhaps we're on the right track here.
Make sure what you're making is very cheap, and then when you sell it, just
One thing we're sorry?
Low wages, sorry.
Yeah, low wages. One thing about this is low wages. You'd think, the idea would be, you know what? People are going to produce in this economy, they're going to mine things like copper in Zambia, But they're not going to turn around and buy electrical goods that contain the copper because they can't afford them. You can do one of two things. You can have cheap raw materials by basically paying people next to nothing, or you can have a captive market because you can't create both simultaneously. Because in order to do so, in order for the manufacturers to make any money, they'd have to be able to sell it at a decent price.
What's the captive market?
Well, captive market is a place where you can sell your goods but nobody else can. That is like a colony, like Catherine said. That you control what comes in and out. Like the British had in India for a long time, where they could sell British-made cotton goods to Indians. And they could outsell domestic manufacturers in India, indigenous cotton weavers, because their prices were much lower. When you get to selling other finished goods, especially the places that were going to produce raw materials like copper, like diamonds in South Africa, you can't necessarily sell because you've got to, in order to make a raw material cheap, you can't pay very much to extract it. It's like the plantation system that the Spanish and the Portuguese start in the Atlantic world in the 16th century. That is, you have to extract resources cheaply. But you can't turn around and make those places a market for your goods. One of the things about this colonialism, and we should look at Gandhi, especially how Gandhi looks at the morality of colonialism and what it means for the country that participates in it, both the colony and the colonizer. One of the things about colonialism is that it does not create in these, what you might call plantation colonies, like Congo that we looked at, it doesn't create any sort of economic infrastructure except that based on extraction. That is, Congo's economy, before colonialism and after, is based entirely on the mining of raw materials. Copper, coltan, uranium, all sorts of stuff. The problem is because that's the only structure the economy has before colonialism ends, when colonialism ends, I think I mentioned this last time, you don't have anywhere to go. You don't have any sort of economic infrastructure there. You don't have markets. When you can sell goods, not just extract primary products for low wages, but when you can sell goods in a place, people come up with all sorts of, you might say sort of, how should I put it, associated types of employment or of businesses. That is, if you're going to bring commercial goods in and sell them, you have people who are going to work in stores, people who are going to sell you insurance for shipments of them, people who are going to warehouse your goods, you need accountants to keep track of what you're bringing in and out. But if all you're doing is moving raw materials out, you never create that sort of infrastructure. You never create a market economy or any sort of institutions which a market economy requires. All you've got is basically this plantation model. And one of the things that happens in a place like Congo is after independence, the only model there is the plantation model. You have a lot of outside interests, economic interests, states, like, for example, the United States or the Soviet Union, who have a huge incentive in keeping this model in place. The companies can continue to sort of export raw materials out of the Congo very cheaply. Nation states want to make sure that these places serve to provide certain of their allies, or provide even them, with cheap raw materials. And you have this sense within a place like Congo that the easiest way to benefit yourself after independence is not to do the hard work of trying to build an economy, but rather you come in and you sort of take the place of the colonizer. That is, you become the new elite and you control access to resources. And that's what someone like Mobutu did, starting in the late 1960s. The man who he killed, or he had killed, Patrice Lumumba, the elected prime minister in the Congo, he had an idea for transforming the economy of the Congo much more dramatically, along socialist lines, which didn't earn him a lot of friends in other parts of the world. But it was not about the idea that you use simply the continuation, or you continue to use one particular model. Mobutu basically says, this is the model that makes the most money right now. I will therefore come in and take charge of it. And he does. He enriches himself, he enriches his friends. He spends money on infrastructure, but not the right sort of infrastructure. He builds runways for himself out in the middle of nowhere. He builds palaces. He doesn't invest. You have Congo, which to this day possesses an enormous, a vast wealth of natural resources that should make it one of the richest places on earth, but it is in fact one of the poorest places on earth. There's no infrastructure. There was no need in the colonial time to develop that infrastructure, and afterwards, the quickest way for those who wanted to enrich themselves was to keep a particular infrastructure going with a lot of encouragement from the outside world. That is, you saw, I think, I can't remember if there was footage or not, of Mobutu, meeting the Queen of England. Posing, there are pictures of him with American presidents and premiers and prime ministers from Europe and around the world, because Zaire, as he called it, kept the raw materials coming to fuel all sorts of industrial growth and innovation. So you have this situation, again, where there are all sorts of incentives on the outside pushing in, as well as incentives internally that combine to keep a place like Congo in this colonial/plantation model. You have what is in essence what some economists might call chronic underdevelopment. There was never any development of, say, the Congolese domestic economy, because that didn't serve the purposes of those who controlled the raw materials. So the problem is that some people in the late 1800s are saying, colonize to get us captive markets. That is not nearly as powerful, ultimately, or as successful an argument as those who say, colonize and get us access to cheap resources, or cheap access to resources. So you have these dual motivations. Colonize for, you might say, strategic or geopolitical reasons, so you get bases, or colonize for economic reasons. Let me talk about a couple of these, you might say, sort of moments of strategic colonialism, just briefly. There's sort of two examples I'd like to talk about how strategic colonialism plays out. Both of which regard, especially Africa, as this place to be divided up, this place to be simply sort of portioned off, by the colonial powers for their own use. Before I get to that, though, let me stop myself for 1 second. I don't want to get hit here. Let me mention one other thing. I talked about the motivations for colonialism. What's driving it? The other thing I talked about was the means. In the late 19th century, there are new ways to travel and to fight and to take care of yourself. All of which are going to enhance the ability of these very wealthy states to take territory. Does anyone know what some of these are? You may have encountered them if you've read in the book a little bit, or you've even sort of looked, or from what we saw from the Congo piece last time.
Train.
Sorry? Train. Railways are going to make travel much easier.
Flight.
Sorry?
Flight.
Not flight. We're not at flight yet. Late 19th century. A couple of others. Steamships. You can now move people and material much more quickly. You can move goods. It's one of the reasons why the market drops out of the grain and livestock, why the bottom drops out of the grain and livestock markets in the late 19th century, because you can move so much and even refrigerate things like beef and butter, sending them from New Zealand and Australia all the way to Britain, for example. A couple of other elements that are important. Machine guns. The late 19th century sees the adaptation of weaponry. All of these pens are disappearing again. One of the most famous is known as the Maxim gun, M-A-X-I-M. Weapons that don't need to be loaded and reloaded, but rather can fire around a second. Produced in industrial states. These are a huge, what you might call in military terms, multiplier. That is, in the military, there's a term called a force multiplier. Does anyone know what a force multiplier is? A force multiplier basically says you can have 100 guys with rifles, or you can have one tank. And that one tank is more powerful than 100 guys with rifles. That is, one tank is a force multiplier. In fact, you might say one tank is equal to, say, 300 men with rifles, maybe even more, if you use sort of Second World War technology as a benchmark. That is, these are things that enable you to bring overwhelming force without having to bring overwhelming numbers. That's the history of weaponry in the last 150 years. How do you inflict more damage while using fewer people? And in the late 19th century, the machine gun, the Maxim gun, is the key. Small armies, whether of Europeans or of Europeans employing indigenous soldiers, can take on enormously large numbers in opposition if they do not have machine guns, if they do not have access to the most up-to-date technology. And we'll talk about one example of how this happens in the Sudan in a couple of moments. The other element, if you've got sort of machine guns, the other M, or not the M, but sort of dealing with it, is the question of malaria. Malaria had, in the 19th century, kept Europeans on the coast of Africa. The piece we watched from the BBC last time talked about, oh, well, no one could sort of sail the Congo River because they couldn't conquer it. They needed the steamships. They needed to figure out ways to get through this territory. That's a little bit misleading because the real reason you couldn't send Europeans inland had been apparent for 300 years by that point. 90% mortality from malaria. That is, the interior of sub-Saharan Africa is this huge malarial zone. Standing water, freshwater, jungle, equatorial conditions, breeding ground for malaria. But in the late 19th century, European chemists and medical innovators refine a compound that comes to be known as quinine. Quinine, quinine. Which is actually a compound that Native Americans, indigenous Americans in South America, had known about for centuries. That's another malarial zone. That is, there's a tree called the cinchona tree, and you could grind up the bark.
Is it that white poison that we were seeing?
That's rubber.
That was rubber, yeah, the white stuff coming out of the trees. Yeah, no, that's rubber, but the only reason you have Europeans there was something that actually originally found in the bark of trees in places like Bolivia and northern Colombia. That is sort of higher altitude cinchona trees. And in the late 19th century, a group of European investors basically took cinchona plantings, or took examples of cinchonas, and began to build large plantations to grow them in Southeast Asia. With the idea that you can use the you use the bark, grind it up into a powder, you would infuse it into other things. What's quinine in? What's the biggest thing that quinine comes in? You've all, well, maybe not all of you, depending on your particular tastes, but many of you may have had quinine in your life.
She knows.
What?
She knows.
She knows? Well, that's okay.
Tonic water.
Tonic water. There's a reason why the British Empire is defined by gin. It's because you had to put something in the tonic water to make it drinkable. Because the tonic water contains quinine. That's why it's so bitter. You look at your average British colonist in the highlands of East Africa at the turn of the century, having 2 or 3 gin and tonics, an hour, then they were medicating themselves in multiple ways simultaneously, you might say. That is, they are protecting themselves against malaria. Quinine doesn't cure malaria. If you get malaria, you've got malaria. Quinine basically inoculates you or protects you against getting malaria. 90-something% of the time. And now, now people get lots of sort of synthetic versions of this. That is, up through the First World War, the 1930s, people relied on quinine. Starting in the Second World War, so much of which in Asia was fought in malarial zones by the British and the Americans in particular, they had to come up with various sorts of synthetic ways of producing quinine. And they produced all sorts of ways that everyone who took it absolutely detested. Because the pills tasted horrible, they turned your skin awful sort of shades of yellow, and everyone sort of sort of suffered through it together. But they managed to keep large numbers of people from getting malaria in the war against Japan, in Southeast Asia and in the Pacific Islands. So you have this medical, I don't know if I'll call it breakthrough, but this enhancement that allows Europeans now to go inland in Africa. Because you can have all the machine guns, you can have all the steamboats, you can have railway technology, but if you can't actually go and stay anywhere because you're going to die of malaria, it's very hard to colonize. So in some ways, it's quinine that is the capstone. It's the final and perhaps the key element to European colonialism around the world. That it allows Europeans to go someplace and stay. So you have motivation, and now you have means. Economic and strategic motivations, new technologies, or the enhancement of existing technologies that allow for people to travel more quickly, fight much more effectively, and protect themselves against disease more securely. Any questions about this? I'm trying to sort of highlight again as we go through, talking about sort of the whys and hows of colonialism. Why do people embark on this? How are they able to do so? That's sort of the larger theme I'm trying to get in today. And what I want to do now is turn to a couple of specific examples of, you might say, strategic and economic colonialism. We've already seen, for example, some examples. The United States taking the Philippines as both strategic and economic. Gives you access to markets in Asia, gives you a huge naval base, or a place to put a huge naval base in the Pacific. Let's talk about a couple of other examples. And watch in these how the means are also important. Not just sort of the motivations, but the means. The first I want to talk about is, I realize this map, I don't know what's wrong with this projector, but it's never been fixed. The first I want to talk about is something called the Suez Canal, which was built in the 1850s and 60s by an independent Egyptian government, which saw this canal as their sort of economic future. It would connect the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. It would allow you to sail from, say, Europe to China or to India much more quickly, because you no longer would have to sail around the southern tip of Africa. Cut journey times enormously, from about 6 weeks down to 2 weeks if you were going from, say, England to India.
What years did you say that was?
In the 1850s and 1860s. And it's in Egypt, which had broken away from the Ottoman Empire, was trying to sort of secure its autonomy, and they looked to the Suez Canal as a way of basically giving themselves a financial footing. They would control the Suez Canal. They hired a French company, gave the French company a contract to build it, and it was opened in 1869. Opened in time to take advantage of, among other things, an enormous amount of steamship traffic, which now sought to go from the Mediterranean into the Indian Ocean. This is the canal. This was taken roughly around 1885, this picture. Various of the great powers, but especially the British, were really interested in the Suez Canal. Because the Suez Canal gave Britain a very much shorter route between the British mainland and their jewel in the crown, as they called it, their colony in India. Made contact much more easy, it made travel much more easy, it made the movement of material and goods so much more efficient. And the British were very concerned that this lifeline, or this sort of vital connection, the Suez Canal, was not actually in their hands. The canal was run by a private company. That is the French company that had built it. The company was owned by French shareholders and by the Egyptian government. That's how the Egyptian government was going to make their money off it. They had sort of, put this job out there. The French company had paid for the right to build it. As part of it, the French company would control roughly half of the shares in the Suez Canal. The Egyptian government got the other half. That was the deal. That's how the Egyptians were going to collect revenue. That's how the French company was going to make money. In the 1870s, the Egyptian government starts to run into significant financial trouble, mostly because of the decline in the global economy. Apart from controlling the canal, one of the few other things that Egypt had going for it was the export of raw cotton. But as the economy slows down, the demand for textiles slows, you don't need as much raw cotton, the Egyptian economy begins to falter. And the Egyptian economy, and the Egyptian government, tries to raise money. And they raise it in a couple of ways. In the first place, they sell most of their shares in the canal company. Or they pledge those shares as collateral, that is, as security, to get loans abroad, especially from banks in London. By the end of the 1870s, Britain has managed to buy about half the shares in the Suez Canal Company from the Egyptians. Furthermore, British banks have loaned enormous sums to the Egyptian government to keep them afloat. Sometimes they did it, they bought shares straight up. Sometimes they made loans with the shares as collateral. The result was these British bankers, who worked, you might say, sort of hand in hand with the British government, they had huge influence in Egyptian affairs by the early 1880s about what Egypt could spend money on, about what the king of Egypt could hope to build in the future, what sort of infrastructure, what sort of education system, what kind of taxes. And in 1880, members of the Egyptian army grow so concerned that these European bankers and advisors are leaning on the king that they rebel. And they say the king has basically now abdicated his responsibility. He's in the pocket of these bankers. And there's a rebellion in Egypt in 1880 and 1881, led by a member of the army. This rebellion, in some ways, scares the British government. In other ways, it sort of provides them an opportunity. The British government are most concerned about the Suez Canal. They want to make sure it stays open and the British shipping can move through without any hassle, and in fact, maybe even get a sort of priority. In 1881 and 1882, the British government declares that Egypt is so unstable and that the rebellion in Egypt threatens the Suez Canal that they have to act. In 1882, the British Navy starts bombing the Egyptian city of Alexandria. And the British Army comes in and helps put down the rebellion with those soldiers who had stayed loyal to the king.
Which army comes in?
The British Army. They bring people from India in particular to come and establish, quote-unquote, order and make sure that nothing threatens the canal. The rebels are defeated. The leader of the rebels is packed off. He spends the rest of his life in Sri Lanka. That's where the British send him. You have a king who remains in Egypt, but the British government is now basically in control of Egypt. They send an advisor don't worry about the name, but this is Lord Cromer, one of the first ones, an advisor who's basically going to sit next to the king and tell him what he can and can't do. Britain, through this figurehead, controls Egypt, and they control Egypt so that they can keep the canal safe. Not safe in a sort of theoretical sense, but safe for their own interests. So this is strategic colonialism at its starkest. The idea that you go and you take control of the country around the canal to protect the canal. And they won't be done, because many in Britain will think that Egypt can't be secure until you've secured the larger regional, or the larger sort of regional space around Egypt, in particular the other parts of the Nile River Valley. In the 1880s and 1890s, the British will mount a series of expeditions to take control of Sudan. And in the, they will, let me see if I have a good illustration here of this. In the 1890s, they will send a fleet, this is from one of the London newspapers, sort of an engraving or a drawing of it. They will send a fleet, note the steamships, south on the Nile, where a combined force of British and Egyptian troops will confront the leader of the Sudan. And they will defeat him. It's called the Battle of Omdurman in 1898. Omdurman. Omdurman. The British were in essence convinced that unless they controlled all of the Nile south of Egypt, that would leave Egypt exposed. In fact, in the 1890s, the French tried to scare the British by mounting an expedition to get to the southern part of the Nile and, in essence, sort of stake a claim to it. But the French couldn't figure out how exactly to get there. They wound up having this expedition leave from Senegal with a few European officers and a bunch of Senegalese soldiers carrying a boat that they broke into parts. They had a sort of hinge system, and they put it back together. And they left, and everyone knew they were coming. And it was about 2 years it took them, if I remember correctly, to cross Central Africa. Everybody knows they're coming. And they showed up at the southern end of the Nile right as this British fleet had finished steaming through and defeating the Sudanese. And the British fleet gave them the ride back up to Alexandria, and then they departed back for France, and it was all over. It was very sort of, I mean, they marched through the jungle. You know, several hundred of these African soldiers in particular died along the way. They were carrying a boat, for crying out loud. The idea was, we'll get to the Nile, and then we'll put the boat together, and then we'll claim it for France. So you sort of wonder at times what people were thinking. But they get there, and the British are already sitting there in their steamships, and they just offer them a ride home. But the British Army at Omdurman in 1898, it demonstrates not only strategic colonialism, the idea that you're taking this colony to protect, you're taking Sudan to protect Egypt, to protect the canal, but you're also using your technological superiority. You use steamships to move troops down, and then you use machine guns here. That is, the British Army was outnumbered about 3 to 1. But they ultimately inflicted close to 40 to 1 casualties. That is, the ratio of Sudanese casualties to British was roughly 40 to 1. And it all had to do with the use of these automatic weapons, these machine guns. Yes?
That's the name of this place?
That's the name of this place, just north of Khartoum on the Nile River in Sudan. One historical footnote is that this is the last place that the British Army will ever use its cavalry in action to do sort of a sweeping cavalry charge at a position. And one of the participants in that is a young lieutenant in the British Army named Winston Churchill. So starting a career of popping up everywhere that will continue for the next 50 years. But it's, again, the use of automatic weapons, the use of technology like steamships to move this army down and to take control of the Sudan. That's strategic colonialism. Let me mention one other type of strategic colonialism very briefly. Or actually, you know what, so we can get through today, I'm going to leave it at this. I'm going to leave it at Omdurman. Because I want to talk about economic colonialism as well. For economic colonialism, We've already looked at what the Belgians are up to in the Congo. I want to talk about one other example of how you, in essence, create a colony that is designed to produce raw materials, that is designed to keep you sort of, how should I put it? Designed to keep you assured of access to these raw materials, but how that leads you to create an infrastructure that isn't necessarily going to do anything for the actual colony. And how you, in particular, how do you get people in places where they haven't necessarily been harvesting or collecting primary products, but have been living oftentimes sort of, agricultural lives, even subsistence lives? How do you get them to go out and collect the ivory and collect the rubber? What do the Belgians do? Violence. Yeah. The British aren't going to use violence as directly. But I want to talk briefly about what the British will do in what's now Zambia. And particular in this region here. Here's the Congo, right here. This region here, the southern Congo, and the northern part of what's called Zambia. This shows you, among other things, migration within Africa during the colonial period, the 19th century. Well, you do have a lot of coastal migration. In South and South Central Africa, you have this inland migration. And it's all based on mining. That is, in the northern part of South Africa, it's diamond and gold mining. Up here, in the northern part of Zambia, it's copper mining. The northern region of Zambia, right up against the Congolese border, is called the Copper Belt, because it sits on top of huge deposits of copper. And it's something the British identify in the 19th century. They're very interested in diamonds and gold down here, but they're also interested in copper for electrical manufacturing. After the British take control of much of South Central Africa in the 1880s and 1890s, they begin to establish the same sort of plantation economy, you might say, that the Belgians wanted to build. That is, look at this. This is within Zambia as well. This is the copper belt up here. And what you see, what the British do is they move people from other parts of, this is a map that was made in the 1980s. That's why Congo up there is called Zaire. But this map shows the movement of people towards the copper belt. The question the British had to deal with was, how do you move these people? Yes, you can build railways. You can bring in mining equipment, coal-powered pumps and everything like that to get the copper, to get the mines, sort of emptied of water, to make the railways go. But how do you get the actual labor? And the British don't rely necessarily on the Belgian system of using brute force. Instead, they use something that's almost sort of, that's a little bit sort of more subtle, but equally sort of insidious. What they do is when they take over this area, they institute a new system of taxes. The shorthand for this system is called the hut tax. They weren't taxing people's dwellings necessarily. It was just an extra tax added on, or an increase in the tax rates of people, which was enough, or which was so great that they could not simply, for example, sell some of their produce, and especially a lot of people living sort of subsistence lives, they didn't have anything to sell in the first place. They could not pay this tax. And if you couldn't pay the tax, the colonial authorities would evict you from your village. So it gets the name the hut tax, basically. They throw you out of your house, evict you from the village entirely. The British introduced this. They say, we are raising taxes, and if you don't pay the taxes, you're going to suffer significant consequences. However, we have heard of a brand new employment opportunity up north, where by sheer coincidence, you can earn enough to pay this tax. It's remarkable how the world works this way. One door opens and then slams in your face immediately. Is a lesson here. Or one door closes and then another one sort of, closes on top of you again. This is what happens. You get a massive migration within Zambia towards the copper belts. You get the creation of this sort of industrial infrastructure, or this sort of mining industrial infrastructure in northern Zambia that just brings in labor by the thousands. It disrupts agriculture in Zambia. It disrupts a lot of family relationships. It causes a lot of migration. Now, and the similar thing is going to be playing out down in South Africa, where again, a system of sort of instituting taxes or instituting penalties for the non-payment of taxes is going to force people to go. So it's not necessarily using brute force, but it's designing a system specifically to funnel labor towards this area. I mean, the British government and the colonial government, they weren't the ones directly doing the mining. What they did is they basically said, people can bid for the contracts to mine. And to sweeten the deal, we guarantee you'll have enough labor, and that labor will work for a minimal amount. How are we going to do that? We're going to put this tax on. And then tell people, you can stay where you are if you pay this tax. If you need some extra money to pay this tax, there's lots of jobs up north. So you get colonialism reshaping the population, or reshaping, you might say, sort of the distribution of population throughout South Central Africa. Not only is this strategic colonialism working to facilitate the takeover or to motivate the takeover of parts of Africa, here you have directly economic colonialism at work, and it's dramatically changing the internal demographics of Africa.
What would you call that when the British went to Zambia?
When they went to Zambia,
Yeah.
it's colonialism. It's imperial rule. They took over.
But there's no certain name, like how they have the own their own war.
Oh, there's no specific sort of battle, necessarily. One of the things that happens is that in South and South Central Africa, the British negotiate all sorts of treaties. All of these sort of private British companies negotiate these treaties with various indigenous elites, and then violate the treaties, left and right, and say, who are you going to take on, us or, you know. There were, in the 1880s, a couple of important battles in South Africa between the British and native forces, one of which the native forces win because they have this sort of absolute overwhelming force. That's in the late 1870s. In the early 1880s, the British come back, and this time they've got machine guns, and everything is different. And by the time the British are pushed up from South Africa into Zambia, a lot of these natives are not going to take them on. The British will start by making these sort of treaties, which will say, you know, you're granting us rights to use this land or access to travel through this land, to, you know, see what else is here, natural resources, things like that. But then those treaties are used as excuses to stay. And you have native communities which can't really do anything about it. I mean, it's a very it's a complicated process of colonialism. I mean, one of the things that the British will do, the French will do, the Belgians will do, even in the Congo, is they will go into a place and they will also look for how is this population aligned. That is, are there groups here that are sort of marginalized? You know, in every society, you're going to have people who have the power, people who don't have power. And one of the things that these colonial powers will do is they will go in and they will begin to forge alliances with groups who are on the margins, groups who are in the minority. You might say, where do these African soldiers come from who will fight for the British, who will fight for the Belgians in the Congo? They tend to come from people who are told, we will give you, they tend to come from groups that are told by the colonial powers, we will give you favors. We will give you a more secure position in the economy. We'll give you a secure position on land. We'll give you government jobs. We'll pay you better if you come and fight and work for us. It's a way of, you might say crudely, dividing and ruling. You go in and you identify splits that may exist in a population. They may not be quite as big yet. But you go in and you say, okay, we're going to drive these two pieces of the population apart. And we will recruit the people who need our help. A similar sort of thing will go on in Asia. In the late 19th century, with the rise of nationalism in India, led by, among others, Gandhi, the British government is going to reach out to Indian Muslims, who make up only about 10% of the population of India, but they will be cultivated and given special political status, recruited more heavily into the army, given more educational opportunities, because it's a way of sort of binding them to the imperial structure. The idea is you create indigenous groups who ultimately will want to keep the colonial structure because it benefits them. But if you go into any sort of system whereby it's going to be majority rule, you don't want that. They want the existing structure. One of the most important examples of this, we'll leave it here after this, but just to think more sort of relevant to present day, in or through the 20th century, various powers, but in particular the British and then the Americans, after they invented the nation state called Iraq, which never existed before, they cultivated an alliance with a group who technically are the minority population in Iraq, Sunni Arabs, who by themselves are not the majority. But instead you have this cultivation of them, cultivation of prominent Sunni Arab elites, like, for example, Saddam Hussein, as a way of basically ensuring access to and order in this territory. The problem is, when you then go in and remove this group, you've got all sorts of problems. Wait till we get to Iraq here. I've got a whole thing for you here. But the big thing is that if you look in Iraq now, a lot of people who are fighting for this group, you've heard of this group called ISIS, or the Islamic State, or ISIL. A lot of people who are fighting with that now are not necessarily really dogmatic or extremely orthodox Muslims. They are people from the Sunni Arab, that is the Muslim Arab community, who were dispossessed because the way Iraq, because they had sort of been used to keep Iraq friendly for almost 100 years, and then they were dispossessed. They're the minority in the population. They're never going to win an election. They're never going to dominate a government, but they want back their privileged position. One of the first things that happened in 2003 was, what is one of the first things that happened in 2003? After the Americans come in, after they take over. Do you remember? There's a very fateful decision taken. I realize it's actually not that recent anymore. 12 years ago. They disband the Iraqi army, and they fire a lot of the Iraqi bureaucracy. A lot of these Sunni Muslims who were in those positions, because up until 2003, they had been kept in positions of power and cultivated by outside forces. Those are the people now motivating this entire movement, or providing it at least with its expertise and its training, and giving it some authority. It's not just people coming in from outside Iraq. It's not just people of a very religiously doctrinaire or a very sort of orthodox form of Islam. It is people who want back the privileged status they had under the sort of neo-colonial or semi-colonial existence that Iraq enjoyed for most of the 20th century. So again, you have this cultivation of indigenous people. So one of the things Gandhi's going to talk about, we'll pick this up on Wednesday, one of the things Gandhi's going to talk about is what do you do when the colonizers come in? How do you treat colonial culture? How do you treat colonial authority? How do you resist colonial authority? Do you do it on your own terms, or do you do it on the terms of the colonizers? And what will that mean for the future? So this was sort of a brief overview of this colonial moment, this imperial moment. We will pick up on Wednesday. I'll make a couple more remarks, and then we're going to talk about Gandhi's Hind Swaraj. If you have not written the first paper yet, you are writing on Gandhi. Please come with a hard copy on Wednesday, if at all possible. Thank you.